Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be joined by acclaimed author and journalist Helene Stapinski to discuss her 2001 national bestseller, Five-Finger Discount, A Crooked Family History. Helene will take us on a gripping, often hilarious, and deeply personal journey through her childhood in Jersey City, New Jersey, a place that was steeped in corruption, grit, and resilience. During our conversation, Helene will share unforgettable stories of her colorful and at times crooked ancestors, along with the everyday struggles and triumphs of growing up in a city where survival often meant bending the rules. With warmth, humor, and honesty, she'll paint a vivid portrait of a family and community that will have you laughing, crying, and eager to hear more. I'd now like to welcome Helene Stapinski to our show. Welcome, Helene.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, James. Again.
Welcome back to our show, I should say.
Right.
So we had you, a little while back, you talked about your book, Murder in, I'm going to butcher this, Matera.
Matera. It's not that hard. Yeah, Matera.
Matera. And you talked about your great-great-grandmother and that whole story about you investigating her story, and there's murder and mystery and all kinds of things. But when I interviewed you about that, you mentioned a book that you had done earlier called Five-Finger Discount, and I was so intrigued by it. Could you just start by telling just a brief overview of what the book is about?
Well, Five-Finger Discount started out as sort of a collection of stories about my family in Jersey City, about growing up in Jersey City, and about the criminal history of Jersey City. I guess you'd call it more corruption, I guess, because Jersey City is historically corrupt, one of the most corrupt places in America, maybe the world. And Frank Hague was from there. People might know him he was a character in Boardwalk Empire. Frank, I am the law Hague. And he was one of the most corrupt politicians ever. He helped get FDR elected. Anyway, so I grew up with this, thinking that was normal. And then, I went to graduate school at Columbia and started writing stories about Jersey City. And everybody was like, wait a minute, what is this? This was just not normal. And that's when I realized that I had narrative gold, basically. And so I started writing those stories, and they kind of dovetailed together and then became this book. So it's about growing up in Jersey City amidst that culture of corruption, basically.
Now, a couple things here. First of all, your writing is so engaging, but there must have been an incredible amount of research done for this book, because a lot of the things that happen in this book were before you were born, certainly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm the narrative arrow that runs through it. I'm the person who takes you through all the stories. So the narrative arc is basically me growing up in Jersey City until fairly recently, until the book came out in 2001. But all those other stories that I tell are mostly stories that happened before I was born. So they kind of fall in wherever they come in, it's just willy-nilly, wherever that story happens to pop up. And so again, it's political corruption stories, but also stories about my family. So all kinds of crazy stories about my family.
It's clear that you writing the book, that you're very vested in the entire story, not just the part from when after you were born. And the characters that are woven through the story. I want to start with one particular character who I believe it's his photograph on the front page of the book, and that would be a character by the name of Beansy. Could you tell us about who he was?
He's my grandfather. Everybody thinks he's a girl because he's got a girl's coat on in that picture, and he was very pretty. He was my mother's father, so he's my grandfather, and he was the worst of the family criminals. He was this career criminal. And, I grew up hearing stories about him. I knew him growing up. He had tried to kill us when I was 5 years old. And that's where the book begins. The night that my grandfather tried to kill us. That's the first line, basically. And again, I thought everybody's grandfather tried to kill them, seemed normal to me. I didn't think it was a thing. And then, of course, realized that was not a normal thing. Anyway, so yeah, so I experienced that. It was one of my first memories. I was 5 years old when he had had a fight with my dad, and he was crazy basically and had a very bad temper and decided he was going to shoot my father, but then take us all out in the meantime, And he was in the tavern downstairs from where we lived above a tavern. He was downstairs and he had a gun and he was telling guys in the bar that he was going up to kill us. And so naturally, one of them called us and warned us what was happening. And so my mom called the cops, and she had grown up with him, so she knew that he would do it. He'd killed several people in his lifetime, and it wasn't a joke. You know, it wasn't an empty threat. And so she called the police, and sure enough, they showed up, and we watched from the kitchen window as they dragged Grandpa away. His nickname was Beansy because he'd stolen a crate of beans off the back of a truck when he was a kid. And so that's where he got his nickname. But he was a very bad guy. And I don't think I think I saw him once more after that. He was living at my cousin's house, and we were there one day, and I saw him. I was very afraid of him. And I'd heard stories about him my whole life. And then when I wrote the book, it started with that chapter, but then I did all this research about all those other arrests. And sure enough, there was a very long rap sheet for him. And it sort of tells his story. He's one of the main characters, one of many, many, criminals in the family. So, but the worst, really. He was the worst. And the one that affected me, probably the worst.
So he wasn't the type of grandpa who bounced you on his knee, sort of grandpa.
No, he was completely insane. I mean, and you got a bad vibe from him as soon as you saw him. I mean, he was just, something was wrong. He had apparently gotten hit by an ice truck when he was a kid. And we think it caused, he had like bipolar disorder, I think. But back then, they didn't really talk about that stuff and it wasn't diagnosed and things like that. But looking back now, we think that's what was happening because there was something wrong with him. He just wasn't normal. He had major issues. He was very handsome though when he was young, which was part of his problem, because he was
Oh,
able to charm my grandmother into marrying him, which she should never have done. But I guess we wouldn't be here if, if it wasn't for the book would not have been written. But yeah, so that's Beansy's story.
yeah. When you start reading the book, you're immediately pulled into the book because you say that your grandfather tried to kill you. So you hook the reader in right away, and it's an incredible ride from there. But tell me about as far as the motivation to really sit down, write this stuff down with the idea that maybe you will put this into a book. What was your absolute motivation underlying this?
Well, I hadn't really planned on writing about Jersey City. I had left Jersey City in my 20s. I had worked for the local paper and had uncovered a couple of other family dramas while I was a reporter at the local paper. And I really didn't want to have anything to do with it, to be honest. And so I moved away. I moved to Nome, Alaska. It's as far as you could go without leaving the continent. I tell people, which it is. It's right near Siberia. And I just got out of Dodge. And so then I went to graduate school. I mentioned this a little earlier. I went to Columbia to get my MFA. And so my thesis was writing about the year that I had spent in Alaska. And so I'm writing this book about Alaska, moving along. And then I would get these assignments in class, like write about your father, write about a childhood memory, write about your grandparents. And so this stuff started to bubble up. I didn't want to write about it, but it was there. It started to come out. And so these stories started to form. And my teachers were like, wait a minute, forget Alaska. What are you doing? You need to write about Jersey City. And I was just like, no, 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 no. I don't want to have anything to do with Jersey City. I'm out. And so I continued to work on that Alaska book. And so I finally finished the Alaska book and I was trying to sell it. And this one agent really liked it. She liked my writing, but she said, I don't know if I could sell this. It was right after Northern Exposure had come out and Alaska had been done already, it was kind of old. And she said, do you have any other ideas? And I said, well, I have all these criminals in my family. I'm from Jersey City. And this was just as The Sopranos was starting. And so her, antenna went off and she was like, that's what I want. Write me that proposal. And so I'd already had all these stories that I had written in graduate school, which I had not published or anything. And so I made a collection of those, but then I started writing some more stuff and it just kind of came. And so I gave her this 50-page proposal. And then strangely enough, I never heard from her again. know if she's out there, I don't know what happened to you, but she kind of disappeared. Maybe she's dead. Maybe my grandfather killed her. Anyway, she just disappeared. But then I had this proposal, and I had these chapters basically. And so I decided to send it out to agents because I had already been sending out the Alaska book to agents. So I had lists of agents that I knew how to go about it. And so I just had sent it out to like a bunch of people and I got an immediate response. It was like immediate. Like the day they got it, they all called me. It was like 10 people, I think, and were like, we're interested in this, send us some chapters. And so I sent whatever I had, which I guess I had quite a bit by then. I had also gone to the Malay colony for the arts in between. So it's a long story. But anyway, so I had written like maybe half the book at the Malay colony. It was a month-long residency. And so I had a big chunk of it, including the story of him trying to kill us and, my father stealing lobster tails off the back of the truck at work and, all kinds of stories, not all horribly tragic. Some of them are kind of funny. And so I sent that out to these people who requested it, and it sold in a weekend over Labor Day weekend, 1999, for quite a bit of money, and changed my life overnight. Changed my life. So I went from being a struggling freelance writer, to being a best-selling author, and having written one of they call it the memoir, it was one of the first memoirs, really, in the memoir craze that we now are in the middle of, maybe ending, I'm not sure. But yeah, it was one of the first ones, after it was really after Mary Carr really wrote the first one, with the Lawyers Club. But it was a very early memoir and it became a bestseller and became a PBS documentary, was optioned for a TV show and, all kinds of stuff. So, and then, when you write a book and it's successful, then you get people calling you to write stories or calling you to teach or calling, it really changed my life.
I'm going to say in a second why I loved the book. And maybe you could take a stab at why do you think this book was so wildly popular? What was it that people found in it, do you think, that, made the book fly off the shelves?
I guess it's a number of things. My voice is pretty accessible. I really do take people along for the ride. For those who don't know anything about New Jersey or Jersey City or corruption, I kind of hold their hand and take them through it. But an astounding number of people do know about that stuff. When I went on my book tour for it, I went on a nationwide book tour when it came out. Everywhere I went, whether I was on the radio or at a bookstore, people like running up to me and saying, "Oh my God, when I was a kid, my uncle was a bookie and blah, blah, blah," and so I would get these stories from people all over the place, everywhere, San Francisco, Chicago, wherever I went. And so there was this culture of sort of graft, throughout the 20th century in America. And no one had really tapped into that, I think, for a book. And so the Jersey City story was kind of universal as far as America goes. And so it's an immigrant story, people coming over here from other places and having to make a go of it and doing whatever you can to do that, So I think that had something to do with it, but who knows? Sometimes, these things are kind of magical. You don't really, you don't know why they become bestsellers, but it's still selling. I mean, it's still in print, 20 years later.
Yeah, I loved it. First of all, your sense of humor right from the beginning is hysterical. I mean, I just love your sense of humor, and
Thank
you're looking at these characters, whether they be family members like Beansy and Aunt Katie, who I want to ask you about later, but also you had some more public figures like Mayor Haig, who he's almost like a boss Tweed type of a character, and how astounded I was to hear about the stuff that he got away with, and then to actually, be somebody who was being supportive of FDR and at that level. And yet the corruption was incredible. But I think the main thing is being a suburban kid all my life, the fact that I could immerse myself into Jersey City and what it was like for you and prior generations to grow up in that environment. There was something, there was something attractive about it. It was like it was old familiar things that were going on. And but you got, lobsters being stolen, you got bookmakers running around, and what were the numbers, the three numbers of the of the
Yeah,
day?
yeah, Yeah, when you played the number, this was before the real lottery, the legal lottery. Years ago, it was an illegal lottery. My uncle Henry was a bookie, and you would play three numbers, and people still do it, I suppose. I think it's still out there. And they would find the number of the day would be the last three numbers of the mutual handle for the racetrack that day. And so anybody could see it at the end of the day. And that's how the number got around. People would say what the number was, and if you hit it, you won money. If you didn't, you didn't. It was like the lottery, but not sanctioned.
And what was very enjoyable was to see this environment through the eyes of different types of characters.
Mhm.
I think you mentioned that some things were just so bad in Jersey City that those people who were really good really stood out,
Oh,
uh,
right.
and and made you cry. Actually, I think you
Yeah. Yeah,
said.
it's true.
Uh,
Every now and then you'd meet like really saintly person, you know. My grandmother was one of them. But yeah, but I wrote this book a really long time ago, and I've sort of like when I wrote it, I was still kind of mad about Jersey City, I think, and I kind of came to terms with it through the book, and so I see it a little bit differently now. I'm also older, 20 years is a long time, and there are a lot of good people in Jersey City. I think they're kind of the salt of the earth, you know what I mean? That people like to use that phrase, but it's true. I mean, they could be really mean. Sort of like sometimes really scared. But once they know you and once you're on board with them, they'll do anything for you. They'll just help you in any way they can. So, and I think I talk about that a little bit in the book, but I've seen that even more so in the years since I've written it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Jersey City is a really nice place to visit in many ways. I know that, I mean, there's places to go eat, there's culture, there's a lot of renewal that took place down there. But certainly it had a history, like a lot of other places had that was not too pleasant. But one thing that really struck me was that you were a person who actually seemed to have a good time at the DMV at one point, didn't you?
I had a great time. There's a whole chapter about the DMV. I just reread the book actually. And that's one of my favorite chapters, I think. My mom was a clerk at the DMV, and she used to bring me to work with her when I was little. And so there's a whole chapter about that. And not just that, but the guy who ran the DMV wound up stealing money from the DMV, but he was this really nice guy. And so it's a whole story about that. He used to take the extra pennies at the end of the night, from the drawer and throw them up in the air for all the kids because my mother's coworkers all brought their kids there. They had a backyard, and we used to play in the backyard. And at the end of the night, we'd come into the main area of the DMV, and Frank would throw the pennies up in the air, and we would run around and catch them. So it was just this incredibly vivid memories of the DMV, which you not normally think that's going to be a happy place, but for me, it was my happy place. The DMV was my happy place. But of course, it all ended because he stole money and then shot himself. And it's all, I don't want to give it away. It's all in the book. But one of many, many crazy tales.
Yeah. So there's this family history. So tell me about how did you get all these stories? How did you hear them? Who did you hear them from? How did you process them and things like that? How did you do that?
Well, this is my first book. And, when people ask, "Oh, how long did it take to write this book?" I mean, literally, like writing it took like 2 years, but I had been hearing these stories for my whole life. So I was in my 30s when I wrote the book. It basically took 30 years to write this book because I was hearing those stories and collecting them in my brain, and I was the youngest one in the family. And so my mom, I think we had a special bond. She was older by the time she had me. I was the third by 7 years from my brother, and so I was kind of her buddy, and she kind of took me everywhere with her, and we just traveled everywhere and did all kinds of stuff together. And she was always just telling me stories, and so she's a storyteller, my mother. I always thought she was the writer as well, but since I've written the book, I found my father's letters to her from when he was in the Marines, and I did a piece about it for the New York Times actually for Valentine's Day a few years ago. It turns out he was a writer, like, and I never knew it because I never really had much of a conversation with him because he died when I was like 22, and we never really had an adult relationship. And he was not a talker. My mom was the talker. So she she was the storyteller, but it turns out he was this really sensitive, great writer. So like it doesn't come out of nowhere. Your talents come from somewhere. And but the stories themselves came from my mom for sure. I mean, she just told stories over and over and over again. She'd tell you the same story. So it was sort of like embedded, like a, I say like a brush stuck in your brain or something, when she's brushing your hair. And so, I'd heard these things, but I didn't know if they were true. It's like you hear these family stories and it's like, yeah, okay, whatever. Yeah. Great grandma was killed by great grandpa in 1920. Yeah, whatever. And so once I started to write the book, once I actually got the contract, really, I went back and dug them out. So I went to the library, I went to criminal records, and everything she said checked out. And it was crazy. And so, and then some, you know what I mean? Like I would be looking for one thing she told me, and I'd stumble across another story that we didn't even hear about. So it was really kind of this crazy gold rush of stories for me. And it was just every time you dug, you found another one. So it was all there in black and white, whether it was a criminal record or in the newspaper, the Jersey Journal or one of the local papers. So everything was documented. So it was a lot of research. It wasn't just stories my mother told me. It was all and any place where I could actually interview somebody or beef it up a little bit with people who were still alive, I did because I was trained as a reporter and I knew how to do that. And so I would fill in the details and but yeah, it was a lot of research, but it's that paired with the sparkling prose that gets you through it, right? It's one thing to do the research, it's another thing to process it and bring it out the other end and tell these stories in an organized, holistic kind of way. And I think I did that with this book. Like I said, it started out sort of just as a collection of crazy stories, but I ran it through the meat grinder, and it became sort of my story about my family.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of had all the perfect ingredients. You had your mom's storytelling, your dad's writing capabilities, and then vocationally,
Exactly.
you investigated things. That's what you did. So it's
Right.
one thing to hear stories. I remember I mentioned this sometimes when I'm on the podcast, but my grandfather was Irish, and he used to tell stories. And I think that probably we needed a fact checker somewhere in the family.
Totally. Yeah. The Irish tell great stories. I mean, they're just naturally great storytellers. I mean, you look at guy growing up in Ireland as a kid, Angela's Ashes. This was like called my book was called The Angela's Ashes of New Jersey. So we didn't have that Irish tradition, but we had the Polish and Italian tradition, and the stories were there. They were definitely there. I just had to dig them out.
Yeah. The other thing is it's an immigrant story. So that it was a big education for me because you bring us into Jersey City and you sort of tell the story that there were different groups of immigrants who were coming through Ellis Island, and then they would make their way to Jersey City because from there many would get on trains because I guess it was a big train hub,
A
wasn't
huge
it?
train hub. Yeah, the train station is still there. You can go visit it. It's pretty amazing.
And that's where it happened. So many of them would get there, and then maybe they knew an uncle Tony who lived in Philadelphia, and somebody else lived out in Iowa or whatever, and off they would go. But you mentioned that your family sort of got stuck in a quicksand there or something,
Yeah.
right?
They were too tired to go any further. It's like they put their bags down and were like, I'm done. I'm just staying in Jersey City. Because it was like every side, it was the Italians, the Polish, and the Russians all settled in Jersey City in my family. They didn't go more than like a mile. I think a couple people went to Bayonne, but they just didn't go anywhere. They all stayed in Jersey City and continued to stay in Jersey City, generation after generation. And it's sort of one of those places, we call it the Golden Door in Jersey City, where people come through there to go somewhere else from another country. But my family just didn't leave. They just stayed. But that lent itself to these stories. So I was really the perfect combination of sort of like being skilled enough and educated enough to write a book, but to be so close, even physically to those stories. You know what I mean? The stories, because I think a lot of people have stories, but they don't know them because their families do move and they evolve and they whatever, go to college or whatever. But my family all stayed in one place. And so it was sort of like this hotbed of stories, but then I was able to write them.
Yeah, and you yourself are a mix of Italian, Polish, Russian. So it wasn't that these folks just stayed within their own nationalities. They did intermarry to some degree, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah. Hudson County, Jersey City in particular, was known for like the Italian-Irish combination or the Polish uh, Irish combination or it's all the Europeans basically mixing it up. Um, Obviously, a lot of people stayed within their nationalities, but I think in my mother's generation, people started to intermarry, I guess you would call it, and yeah, so it sort of made for a rich stew. My mother was Italian and Russian, and is Italian and Russian. She's still alive. She's 93, and my dad was Polish, so there was all kinds of great stories and great food too.
You wonder about people getting off the ship. They're coming because something like in Murder in Matera is there's a reason why your great great grandmother was fleeing to this country, but everybody had a story coming through Ellis Island. And you think to yourself, those who did stay right where they landed, like your family, was it that they felt like I'm exhausted, I've escaped, I've come to this, and I'm just going to let whatever I think is going to happen right here. I'm not going anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean they'd had such hard lives from where they came from, and that's what Murder in Matera was about, to find that what that story was. Why did they stay in Jersey City? What happened? Why were they so traumatized? And they were traumatized. There had been a murder in my family in southern Italy. So that book was kind of a prequel to Five Finger Discount to show why they came to America. And so that was that story. And now I have uncovered, and this is maybe my fifth book. I'm going back to Poland in the fall. I just applied for a Fulbright to research my Polish family because that is pretty traumatic as well. So it turns out my Polish family, I've just learned, really, I've confirmed, was Jewish. And my great grandfather was Jewish. And he not only converted and married a Catholic woman, but changed his name. And I just found out his name. And so I'm going back. So yeah, so they came here, they were completely traumatized. It was like, during the pogroms and everything else. I mean, they came here just sort of like running away, basically.
Yeah, and one of the other reasons why I thoroughly enjoyed the book was that there's sort of this, in a way, these criminal activities are funny in some ways because they're so blatant, and it seems like people didn't even really notice it because it was such a way of life. But one of the things that I was doing research on a family member of mine, as a matter of fact, our very first podcast episode, my wife interviewed me about him. It was a boxer by the name of Awful, AWFUL, Orville Gardner, and he was a
Okay.
bare knuckle boxer who ended up becoming a Christian evangelist, but he was known as one of the worst characters in New York City.
Huh.
And one of the things he did, besides beating people up in bars, was that he was called an immigrant runner. And the runners, you probably know, would hang around, Ellis Island or Castle Garden, whatever it was at the time, or Jersey City, Newark, or whatever. And they'd sort of kind of rip off these poor immigrants who had nothing and promise them things. And he was a pretty bad guy who turned into a very pretty good guy. But one article I came across was that he was fleeing the law and he was arrested at the train station in
Jersey
Jersey
City.
City.
Of course he was. Yes.
Isn't it great? So I have a family tied to Jersey City.
Well, everybody does. They may not know it, but everybody's got a Jersey City story. They just don't know it. Like somebody came through from everybody's family, came through Jersey City. And if you dig far enough, you're gonna find it. They just did. Uh,
So obviously you did a lot of digging, a lot of verifying, but you talk about the political machine in Jersey City. You talk about the really the struggle for power sometimes between maybe the Irish or the Italians and you obviously do a lot of digging. You know your history really well and what was going on and how in the Depression they might be able to take advantage of people more than when we came out of the Depression and that. But I think the real nuggets are these people and people. You just got to read the book. But if we could, just talk about a couple main characters, the characters who rose to the top of the sauce, and one of them has to be Aunt Katie.
Absolutely. That's
Tell
what
me
I was.
about her. Tell me
Aunt
about her.
She's one of my favorite characters of all time. So Aunt Katie was Beansy's sister. So Beansy's the bad grandfather, right? Who's a murderer. His sister was Katie. And they had a lot of brothers and sisters. They were like 12 kids in that family. But Aunt Katie was special. She was the best one in the family, really. And she was her father's favorite. Her father, the one who came from Italy, was a barber right across the street from City Hall. And so she would work with him in the barber shop, and he would cut the heads of all the big politicians, including Haig. They all had their mugs, and he would shave them, using their personal mugs. And so she got to know everybody. She was just one of those personalities. I think I've inherited some of her, that
So,
able to talk to anybody kind of thing. And so she was just a great person. And if she had been a man, she probably would have been mayor eventually. But it was pretty sexist at the time. This was, she was born around the turn of the century. Um, so the next best thing was she had two sons, and one of them was a boxer and a longshoreman, basically, and the other one became a lawyer, went to Harvard Law School, and so she really prepped him to become mayor of Jersey City, and he ran countless times in Jersey City, and never won. But she was what was known as a fixer, and so basically she worked at City Hall, and her job was to fix the problems of people who came in. So she worked for Haig or whoever was in power at the time. It changed hands over time. But so say, I don't know, your mother was sick and you needed a hospital bed, she'd get you a hospital bed from the medical center. And this was maybe legal, maybe not, whatever. But whatever you needed, you would get from Aunt Katie. And in return, you would have to vote for that mayor, when they ran for re-election. And so one of the things that Aunt Katie did was she would work the polls, the voting polls, and they would put ashes on the lever of the person you were supposed to vote for. So when the person went into the voting booth, they came out, she would go to shake their hand. And if they didn't have ashes on their hand, she knew that they hadn't voted for the right person, and they would probably get beaten up. I don't
of course.
fair, but that's the legend. So yeah, so she was a good person, but there was a very dark side to it all. She worked the bingo game, at their parish and would fix it. She would get kickbacks from people who were playing bingo. They would give her money, and she would like call their numbers. So I mean, everything was just corrupt. It was right down to the bingo game. I don't think that even made it into the book. I'm going to save that one for the next book. But so many stories, I can't even include them all. But yeah, Aunt Katie she was just a real piece of work, and one of my favorite people, really. She had a gun. She kept a little gun like in her sideboard in the dining room and would show it to us every now and then. She'd have a shot of Canadian Club every day. She said it kept her lungs clear. And she smoked like a chimney too. She smoked, I think she smoked, was it Chesterfields or Lucky Strikes? Lucky Strikes with no filter. She said the filters gave you cancer. So
Okay, of course they did.
yeah, but she lived to be like 90. Maybe she was onto something. On the Canadian Club / Lucky Strike diet. But she was just a real character, and so she's obviously a character in the book. She comes and goes, and she was sort of a role model for my mom.
Yeah. There was one scene where you had me really, really laughing was you were describing an evening. I think maybe your cousin was, or your mother's cousin maybe was running for office. You had mentioned Mike, was it?
Mike, yeah,
Mike, and that she was up on the stage doing something, but she had put a dress on
yeah,
that she actually put her false teeth in, and you said
yes.
they were kind of creepy.
Yeah, I had never seen her with the false teeth, and she only put them in for special occasions. Like whenever we went to visit her, she wouldn't put the false teeth in, and she's up on the stage, and I'd never even seen her in a dress. She was in pants, and and I didn't even recognize her. It was a really weird moment for me, that night he had lost the election, and she was up there singing "Bye Bye Blackbird" and crying, and it's just this poignant moment, I think, in the book. And one of the things that I couldn't really talk about in the book at the time, because when I got the book contract and I was working on it, when I interviewed my cousin Mike, who had run for mayor, he was still alive at the time. And so you can get sued for things. So you have to be careful what you say. So one of the things I left out, but then wound up writing about later after he died, was that he was a mob consigliere. And so Aunt Katie was in with all the mobsters in town. And so she had gotten him a job as a lawyer with them. And that kind of ruined his life, because he was this brilliant guy. He'd gone to Harvard Law, and he winds up working he'd gone to school with Justice Scalia. and he winds up working for the Genovese crime family, as their consigliere. And I kind of knew, but nobody talked about it too much. It wasn't one of the things you really wanted to talk about too much in the family. But I was covering a criminal trial, a mob trial, while I was at the Jersey Journal. And I'm listening to the secretly recorded mob tapes. The FBI had planted bugs. And in the transcript and in the recordings is talk about my cousin Mike.
Ouch.
It's like, oh no. So I'm covering the story and like, do I call my mother and tell her? Do I call my editor? Because Mike was a high profile guy. He had run for mayor, again and again. And I think I wound up telling my mother and the editor, and it wound up being in the paper and he got disbarred and all kinds of crazy stuff happened. But he was still alive when I wrote the book and I actually interviewed him about a lot of stuff. And but then he died just as it was coming out. But it was already written, so I couldn't add the mob consigliere stuff. It was too late. But I do have some stories about that, which maybe will make their way into some future book. And yeah, and I actually wrote a piece about that for the Times as well. I did. They used to have the Lives piece at the back of the Times magazine every week. It was one of the few memoir pieces that you could place. And so I think it's called I Like Mike or something like that. That was the title of it. But if you put Mike and Helene Stapinski, it'll pop up. It's an essay. It's the stuff that I could not include in the book, basically.
Because that was a long time ago, that book. And I know here the book's been out this long, but I said to Kelly, my wife Kelly, that I have to talk to Helene about this book. I can't miss an opportunity. But the way that you sort of laid out the backdrop to all that was going on was brilliant. You talked about the soap factory and how if somebody wanted to wash their windows, they didn't need soap because
Yeah, if you live downtown near the Colgate factory, the soap would just sort of drift through the air on certain days. It depends what they were making. But yeah, you didn't need soap. You just had to put some water on it, but suds up.
and can you tell about the pencil factory for a minute about your mom worked there?
Yeah, yeah. The thing about Jersey City was it was a center for industry, and so everybody worked at a different factory, and you got stuff for free from the factory every day or whatever, once a week or whatever. It was sort of part of the benefits package. You got a box of pencils or whatever. So my mom worked at the General Pencil Company, which is actually still there. It's one of the few factories that's still in Jersey City. It's kind of amazing. It's near Journal Square on the highway. And so she worked in the dip room. And so her job was to dip the pencils in the yellow paint. And one time she like spilled the yellow paint like all over her shoes on the floor and got in trouble. But she was in high school at the time. And but there's another floor where they put the erasers on the pencils. And so she had access to the pencils before the erasers were put on. So none of her pencils at home had erasers on them. And I said it made her become a more careful writer. It's like she couldn't erase it at school. She never had the erasers. But yeah, everybody had a story about working in a factory. There was the Colgate factory, there was the American Can Company. My dad worked at the cold storage warehouse, at which, if you've ever driven through the Holland Tunnel, in the last 50 years, you would know it's not there anymore. But as you would make your way down towards the tunnel, there was a big red building to your left, and it said cold storage, Union Terminal Cold Storage, and that's where he worked. And it was basically where the trucks would come and drop off or pick up frozen food. It was a frozen food warehouse right before the Holland Tunnel. And so he would bring home frozen food every night. And so we ate lobster tails, steak, all kinds of shrimp cocktail. We had the best meals. And I thought that was normal. Again, I thought everybody was eating that every night, lobster tail. I move out and I'm like, oh, lobster's expensive. Yeah. I thought that was just a staple. We're having surf and turf tonight. So
Wow. So in your early years, you lived in one part of town, but then you moved across to above a tavern. What was it like living above a tavern?
it was not good. I mean, it was not a great spot, to be honest. It was it attracted a bad element, as we would say. There were drug dealers there, obviously alcoholics moving in and out all day long. It would open in the morning, people would be in there early drinking. Um, it was home to me, so I knew most of the alcoholics. who hung out there. I mean, they knew me by name. It wasn't a big deal for me, but it was not a great place to grow up, really. I mean, it was not a great place. There were drug dealers, but also people would do drugs in our hallway. We would find hypodermic needles everywhere. This was during, the 70s, the major like heroin problem that was going on in all cities. And it was seedy. It was just seedy. Not a good place.
Yeah, I think things have been cleaned up quite a bit because I don't know if you remember I think it was the late 70s when a couple of these garbage barges from New York sank off the coast of New Jersey, and there were hypodermic needles and medical waste
Yes,
hooked
washing up
up.
on the beach. Yeah.
Yeah, but I've noticed that you did, and my wife and I watched it the other day. You did a documentary for PBS, right?
Yes.
On Five Finger Discount. First of all, it was excellent.
They did a
And
great job with it. Yeah, I was very happy with it.
yeah, and you were actually driving around and sort of telling your story and everything. How long ago was that documentary?
I think that came out around 2018 or so. Yeah, it was quite a few years ago, but the book had gotten optioned for a TV show, like a Wonder Years type thing, but a little girl growing up in Jersey City, narrated by that girl. And it never really got off the ground. It kept getting re-optioned and rolled over, rolled over. At one point, the guy who did Ally McBeal, what was his name? He was big at the time. He was a big producer. Anyway, he had the rights to it. But it just never got off the ground. And finally, I saw the teleplay for it. I was in LA for my second book. I was on book tour for my second book. And I met with the agent out there who was pitching stuff to Hollywood. And I said, I never got to see the script for Five Finger Discount. Can you get me a copy of it? She's like, yeah, sure. So she drops it off at my hotel. Oh my God. Thank God it never got made. I mean, it was so bad. I almost like drowned myself in the pool at the hotel where I was. I was like, oh my God, this cannot happen, because it was still optioned at that time. It wasn't, it wasn't dead yet. But it was just terrible. It took place in New Jersey, but it was like whoever wrote the script had never been to Jersey City. And so it was like suburban New Jersey. Like people had lawns and stuff, which is not Jersey City. Nobody's got a lawn in Jersey City. And it had my grandfather running around with a gun, like with a laugh track, my mother stealing money from the DMV, which she never did, right? She was like the only person in my family who didn't steal anything. So I see this in the print. I'm like, oh my God, my mother's gonna have a stroke. This cannot happen. Oh my God. And once they option it, you have no rights really. They take it and it's like theirs. And at that point, I was just praying that it wouldn't get made. I think I said a rosary, I got my mother to say a novena that this doesn't get made. And it didn't. It died. It died a slow death. And so finally, I did a story for the Times about the Flatiron Building, about how weird it is to work in the Flatiron Building. Okay, because some of those rooms are really weird and small. And one of the people I interviewed was the granddaughter or whatever of the person who built the Flatiron Building, one of the people who had developed it. And so we kind of hit it off. We became friends. And she read Five Finger Discount. And she said to me, oh, they had made a documentary about the Flatiron Building. She had just been a producer on it. And so I'd watched that documentary. And so she read Five Finger Discount. She said, oh my God, like this needs to be a documentary. And that never even occurred to me. Like it had been optioned for so long to be a TV show that it didn't really occur to me that it should be a documentary, right? And so I was burned from that experience, though. That option was done, it was over finally. And she's like, I'm going to give this to my producer friend, who works with PBS. Do you mind? And I was like, oh, I was a little nervous because having been through that experience, like, I don't want a bad thing to happen with this book. And so she gave it to him and he fell in love with it immediately, called me immediately, and he wanted to produce it. And, but he was a great guy, and Charles Hobson, his name was, and we worked on it together. He made me a producer and a writer, and we brought in a director and all kinds of tech people, the film crew, and they worked on it for several years. I mean, it took because it was a passion project for them because it wasn't going to make a lot of money. Documentaries generally don't make a lot of money, so whatever they were working on, whenever they had a break, they would work on Five Finger Discount, and so I became the narrator of it, and it was really a work of love, for everybody involved. And I think it really did come out great. It's just, it takes it to the next level, sort of, because the book had been out a while already. And so you get to see how Jersey City really had changed, because when I wrote the book, Jersey City was just beginning to change, but by the time the movie came out, which was like I said, around 2018, that was at least 17 years after the book had been written, major changes had happened in Jersey City. And so that's part of what the documentary is about. So it takes the book, but then takes it to the next level, kind of. So
Yeah, because I hear a lot of good things about Jersey City now, but man, it's got a rich past, and you captured a
yeah,
lot of it.
it's still pretty down and dirty. You don't have to go too far to find it. It's nicer on the edges, but uh,
If you could sit down with Aunt Katie now, what do you think she would be saying about you and what you've done with your life?
she had a sister who was still alive. She was the only sibling of that crew, my Beansy and Aunt Katie and that whole crew. Her name was Aunt Violet. And she was so mad that I wrote the book, and she used to like write letters to the editor of the Jersey Journal as if they're going to do anything. It's like, it's like a national bestseller. She's writing letters to the Jersey Journal. And just was very angry that I had told these stories out of school. So that was just not something you did. So I don't know if Phil Katie'd be so happy about it, to be honest, unless I gave her a cut. If I gave her some of the money that I got for the book deal, maybe she would have been okay with it. But it was not okay to tell these stories. And there's still people mad at me in my family.
Well, if you didn't record these stories, they'd be gone. They'd be gone to history. It's as if these people never made a mark.
Right, exactly.
And look, people, not to excuse illegal activity, but I think a lot of people it was sort of inbred into them, and a lot of it was about survival.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I don't blame most of the people. I mean, my grandfather, I blame. He was terrible. But everybody else, it was just the environment. I mean, the corruption was all around you. So why not steal the box of lobster tails? You know what I mean? If everybody's stealing, if the mayor's stealing, it trickles down. So it's okay. It's this culture of corruption.
I think when you see people perpetrating real cruelty on other human beings, that you say, "Oh, there's a special sort of a lowness about that," and you hate that to be a person in your family tree, but it happens. We all have somebody somewhere that
Yeah.
is a beansy, I guess,
Yeah,
right?
there's a bad egg. I think everybody's got one bad egg probably floating around, if not more than one. Yeah, because most of it was victimless crimes. I mean, it was mostly people stealing things and stuff like that. I had one of my uncles. You talked about the runners. He worked at City Hall. I don't know if you remember him, Uncle Frankie. He
Yes.
would stop people on their way to get married and tell them he could give them a marriage certificate for less half price or whatever it was, give them a discount. And he would take them to this place where there was a judge but it was all made up. It was just a scam. And so all these people got married and they weren't actually married. They found out years later that it wasn't a real ceremony and it wasn't a real marriage certificate. So, I mean, those are victims, I suppose, but it's not, terrible violent crime victims. My family didn't have many of those. There were a couple, but most of it was sort of lighter. Lighter
Lighter
crimes.
on the crimes. I
Yeah.
I don't think you said this in the book at all, but did Beansy ever was he ever nasty or mean to Aunt Katie, his sister?
He must have been. I mean, I never saw it because I wasn't around him all that much. Like I said, because I was when he tried to kill us, I was 5. That was one of my first memories. So I didn't see a lot of interaction with him with other people. He had lived with us for a little while. That's why he wound up trying to kill us. And but I don't remember. But they must have had fights because that family was always fighting. There was always just like, and they were always fighting. Like if you would go to one of my aunts or uncle's houses, every time you went, there was a huge fight. They would just scream at each other and throw things at each other. So they'd make up eventually, but then they'd fight again. So I'm sure because he was so much trouble, and Aunt Katie, she was pretty tough. So I would imagine she would give him a hard time about stuff. But I don't remember them actually fighting, but I could ask my mother, she would know. And whenever I had a question, that's what I would do. I just ask my mother, hey, did Aunt Katie? I'm like, let's call her now. I mean, I'm sure she remembers. I'm sure they did fight.
Yeah, you'll have to email me and let me know.
I will. I will. I'll call her when we're done. She'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, you hear about some families like you'll have, happy holidays playing in the background and somebody's cursing and screaming and throwing themselves across the table at somebody. And then it's like, so what do you want to do tonight? You want some coffee? Do you want?
Yeah, yeah. That's the kind of family they were. I mean, it was really very, I don't know what the word is. They all had tempers. And that was actually the opposite of my Polish family. Like my Polish family was very laid back and very nice, very good people. Nobody really fought with anybody. They went to church all the time. Like I don't remember my Italian relatives going to church, really. They weren't very religious. But the Polish side was the religious side.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I wanted to find out, you mentioned you're going on I think you're going to be going on a trip soon. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, it's not for sure yet. I applied for a Fulbright Award to go to Poland to research the Polish side of my family. I have a great grandfather who it turns out was Jewish. Like I said, he converted to Catholicism, changed his name, which I did not know until a few months ago. And so I just want to find my last book that I wrote was about the Holocaust. And so it got me interested in the whole topic. And that's why I started to poke around in it. And I went to Poland in May and met my relatives who I had really never met before. Because my grandmother came over with one sister, but left a bunch of siblings behind. And so those siblings stayed in Poland, the same town, and all of their kids and grandkids and great grandkids are still there. And so they're there and I went to visit them and they were fabulous. It was great. It was such a great trip. It was amazing. And like I said, the Poles they're calmer and they're nicer and they're just good people. And their last name is Dobrowolski, which means good. Dobrov is good, right? And one of the things that happened when I was there, my son came with me. He's a writer as well. He's a fiction writer. He's 25. And so he was the one who really pushed me to go on the trip because I had been talking about this story for a long time. We had heard that the family might be Jewish. He's like, why don't we just go? Let's just book it and go. Let's just go. I was like, yeah, what am I waiting for? I'm not getting any younger. I'm going to be 60 next week. And so we booked the flight. We go to Poland and, they greet us. They take us to the house. They've got this big meal. They're just terrific. They're telling us stories. And so I'm interviewing the oldest cousin who's like in her 80s. And the kids are starting to get bored because, then my daughter comes over to meet us from Paris because she had been studying for the semester in Paris. So she comes over. Paulina comes. We've got Dean. It's me. Paulina and Dean are starting to get a little antsy. One of my cousins says, hey, do you want to go visit cousin so-and-so? He's got a lion.
Oh, okay.
So they're like, yeah. And I'm like, not paying attention. I'm interviewing this older relative. And I'm like, where are you guys going? Oh, somebody's got a lion in their yard. We're going to go see it. What? So they go. I'm not really paying that much attention. 2 minutes later, a photo from my son. He texts me a photo of a full-grown male lion in a yard. I can probably show you a picture. I don't know if I can find it. So it turns out my Polish relatives are as crazy as my relatives. Anyway, I'll send you a picture of mine. But I went running over there because, like, oh my God, they're going to get eaten by this lion. They didn't. It was fine, but that's whatever. That's the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going back, and I'm hopefully going in the fall and try and dig around and see what I come up with. So it might be another 5-finger discount. We'll see.
Oh, I hope so, because this book was fantastic. It's Five Finger Discount, A Crooked Family History, Helene Stapinski. Helene, how can people find out more about what you're up to and other books that you've written?
Well, I have a website. It's helenestapinski.com, and it's all right there. So go and check it out. I've written 4 books at this point, and hopefully working on the 5th. It's also got some of the articles I've written, including the one about my dad that I talked about his love letters to my mom. My greatest hits are on there. But if you just Google Helene Stapinski, New York Times, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of stories that I've written for the Times. So on all kinds of topics.
Well, keep doing what you're doing, Helene, because it's a lot of fun and your humor is great. I noticed you had written that in the book that there's humor that runs through your family. And I guess some have it, some don't, but you definitely have it. And I think you have to have humor when you tell stories because sometimes you have to look at your own family and yourself and laugh sometimes and say, there's really a lion in the yard?
Yeah, exactly. No, you got to have a sense of humor. Growing up in Jersey City, you have got to have a sense of humor because you wouldn't survive. I mean, that's survival, having a sense of humor. You got to laugh at it. And that book is those two things. It's got the tragedy, but it does have the humor to it as well.
All the best to you and your family, your mom, and God bless Jersey City.
Yeah, really. Thank you so much for having me again.
You're welcome. Well, I want to have you back for your next book for sure.
Okay, I'll let you know. I'll keep you posted.
Please do. So have a great day, Helene.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, Be well and God bless.